Summer 1943. The sun hung heavy over northern France, not with warmth but with the oppressive weight of dust and silence. A train yard stretched out like the ribcage of a dying beast, steel tracks splintering into weeds, freight cars yawning open with rust-bitten mouths. From one such car shuffled a line of women, old women, their backs bent beneath invisible burdens, their faces carved into masks of war and fear. They were German, prisoners taken in the sweep of Cherbourg, though their threadbare skirts and kerchiefs made them look less like enemies than weary grandmothers caught on the wrong side of history. Yet in their minds, the whip waited. Frau Margaret Hoffmann clutched her shawl tighter, though the air was stifling. 63, with hands once known for kneading dough, she had been a baker before the Reich turned flour into rations and ovens into factories of war. She had watched soldiers strip her bakery of its warmth, conscripting even the yeast for the army kitchens. Now, as she stumbled across the gravel yard, the phantom memory of bread haunted her more cruelly than hunger. Beside her, Clara Weiss muttered under her breath, every word barbed with bitterness. 58, tall even with her shoulders hunched, she still carried herself with a rigidity that mocked her frailty. She had been a nurse for wounded German soldiers, a witness to boys screaming in linens that smelled of disinfectant and despair. She had seen American artillery turn men into whispers. In her mind, capture by Americans meant vengeance, the kind extracted not from soldiers but from symbols. She feared that her age, her gray hair, would not shield her but expose her to humiliation. And then there was Elsbeth Kruger, 71, who shuffled last in line, her lips moving soundlessly. She had lived long enough to see empires rise and break like porcelain cups. Kaiser Wilhelm's, now Hitler's. To her, survival was a matter of adjusting the story one told about oneself. Still, as she walked, she wondered whether this would be the last chapter. She thought of the whip again, not abstract but specific, a lash cracking across her grandson's back in a training camp. She imagined it mirrored here. The American soldiers waited at the edge of the yard, boots planted firm, rifles slung casually across shoulders. They were young, younger than Margaret's son had been when he died at Stalingrad. Private Jimmy Walker chewed gum, his cornflower eyes sweeping over the women with something like disbelief. He had grown up in Iowa, among fields that stretched so wide they could swallow secrets. He had imagined German prisoners as hardened men with jaws set like stone. Instead, he saw grandmothers' shawls, swollen ankles. For a brief moment, he wondered whether his own grandmother back home, who still cursed the Depression while baking pies, could have been mistaken for an enemy if fate had drawn the borders differently. Sergeant Anthony Romano, older and broader, broke the silence with a grunt. His accent carried the grit of Brooklyn mixed with the softness of southern Italy. He squinted at the women, then muttered to Captain Harold Spencer, "What the hell do we do with grandmothers? Put him in the brig with the men." His voice was low but not cruel, more baffled than anything. The captain didn't answer right away. Captain Spencer was a man hardened by command, 41 years old, with a jaw that had long ago learned the art of clenched silence. He had seen the ugliest version of war already, men drowning in Normandy hedgerows, comrades silenced by mines. To him, these women were neither harmless nor dangerous. They were a responsibility. Paperwork called them POWs. His conscience called them a problem. The women were herded toward the camp with clipped orders, not whips but firm gestures of rifle barrels. Yet in the women's minds, each movement of a soldier's arm was prelude to violence. Margaret whispered to Clara, "They'll make examples of us." Her voice cracked like old wood. Clara answered only with a hissed prayer that tangled German syllables with fear. Inside the camp, barbed wire coiled like a serpent around the perimeter. Watchtowers stood skeletal against the sky, machine guns glinting in the light. The women's hearts thudded as they entered, as if stepping into the mouth of some mechanical beast. Every clank of the gate behind them sounded like a verdict. Nurse Ellen Carter observed from a distance, her hands folded behind her back, the faint scent of antiseptic clinging to her uniform. At 27, she had grown accustomed to wounds, but this was something different. A caravan of elderly women, eyes wide with terror, faces stiff with pride. She saw not the enemy, but echoes of her own aunts and neighbors back in Ohio. Still, she said nothing, aware that sympathy was a dangerous indulgence in war. The women were led to barracks, wooden huts that smelled of dust and damp straw. A guard barked for them to sit, and they lowered themselves stiffly onto benches. Silence pressed on them until the sound of boots broke it. Romano entering with a clipboard, glancing at them as though they were livestock to be counted. One by one, names were demanded, ages scribbled down, places of birth recorded like footnotes to a collapsing empire. Margaret felt each question as an accusation. Her voice wavered as she gave her details, as though the very act of speaking them out loud exposed her to punishment. When Romano reached Elsbeth, the old woman fixed him with cloudy eyes and said, "I have lived through 3 wars. Will you whip me for each?" Romano froze, pen hovering above paper, then scratched down her words without reply. Time stretched in that barack, the air heavy with dread. Each woman rehearsed silently the images of torment she had been promised in whispers of propaganda. Americans stringing up women as traitors, soldiers laughing as they lashed captives. Fear painted whips in every shadow. Yet as dusk descended, something strange occurred. Instead of the crack of leather or the bark of punishment, the women smelled smoke, aromatic, warm, almost sweet. It wafted through the barracks, threading through cracks in the wood. Margaret lifted her head first, nostrils flaring with disbelief. Bread, real bread. The scent was unmistakable. It carried her back to mornings when she would dust flour from her apron, sliding loaves into ovens with a practiced hand. Her eyes stung with tears she did not permit to fall. Clara muttered, "A trick. They want us to suffer more." But her stomach betrayed her with a growl that made one of the younger guards smirk. Even Elsbeth tilted her head, whispering to herself, "No whip smells like this." The barack door creaked open, light spilling across the women's faces. Corporal Walker appeared, holding a tray, his gums still working in his jaw. On the tray lay bowls of stew, bread broken into chunks, and, was it possible, pork glistening with fat. He set it down with an awkward shrug, as though embarrassed by the act. For a moment, silence reigned. None of the women moved. Their eyes darted from the food to the soldiers, as if expecting the trick to reveal itself. The whip was still in their imagination, hiding behind the steam. Walker cleared his throat and said, "Eat." Just one word, simple, unadorned. Margaret's hands trembled as she reached for bread, her fingers hovering over the crust as though it were a relic, fragile and sacred. Her chest tightened, not with relief but with suspicion, disbelief fighting hunger in a silent battle. She looked at the bread, then at Walker's young, unlined face. And in that moment, every prophecy of cruelty clashed with the impossible smell of pork roast and fresh bread. What followed would shatter everything they had been taught to expect. The first bite was taken not by hunger, but by disbelief. Frau Margaret Hoffman's trembling hand tore a corner of bread, still steaming faintly in the cool air, and for a moment she stared at it as though expecting the crust to splinter into ash. She pressed it to her lips, the warmth seeping into her skin, and when she finally chewed, her eyes shut tight against the flood of memory. Flour-dusted mornings in a small German village, her husband laughing as he stole heels of bread fresh from her oven. Children gathered around the table before the world cracked apart. The taste was so ordinary it became extraordinary. Tears she had sworn she would never give her captors betrayed her anyway, rolling silent down weathered cheeks. Clara Weiss sat rigid, refusing to touch her portion. Her pride battled the gnawing ache of her stomach. She had seen soldiers feed prisoners before, just enough to keep them alive for another day of labor. To accept food was to accept subjugation. Yet the smell was relentless. Roasted pork glistening with its own juices, bread with a crust that crackled softly under the knife, butter melting into golden pools. She clenched her jaw, but her body betrayed her with a low, humiliating rumble. The young corporal, Walker, glanced at her with a half-smile, as if to say hunger was universal and therefore nothing to be ashamed of. That smile only sharpened her defiance. She glared at him, muttering in German, "Tricks taste the sweetest." Still, when no one was looking, she pinched off a crumb of bread and slipped it into her mouth. Elsbeth Kruger, oldest of them all, wasted no time. She reached for pork with hands unashamed, chewing noisily, almost defiantly. "A woman my age doesn't have time for pride," she said in her dry, cracking voice. "Bread is bread, no matter whose oven made it." A ripple of nervous laughter rose from a few of the women. The Americans glanced at one another, surprised at the sound. War camps were not places where laughter grew. Yet here it was, fragile as glass, resting on the steam of food. Sergeant Romano stood nearby, arms folded, watching with an expression that hovered between suspicion and something gentler. He was the one who had seasoned the pork, sprinkling in herbs from a pouch he carried like contraband. Cooking, for him, was a link to his mother's kitchen in Brooklyn, where pots simmered while the radio sang news of distant wars. He had wanted, if only for a night, to eat something that reminded him of home. Now, watching these women taste it, he realized the meal had become something else entirely. It was not only sustenance. It was a truce neither side had chosen, yet both seemed to accept in silence. Captain Spencer observed from the shadows, his hands clasped behind his back. He measured every gesture, every bite, against regulations and against conscience. The Geneva Convention required humane treatment of POWs, but nowhere did it say they must be fed pork roasts or fresh bread. This, he told himself, was a luxury they could ill afford, a crack in discipline that might spread. Yet another part of him, quieter, harder to suppress, saw the tremors in Margaret's hands easing as she ate, saw Clara's sharp gaze soften for the span of a heartbeat, saw Elsbeth's toothless grin. He wondered whether mercy could be more dangerous than cruelty. The camp air shifted that night. Soldiers accustomed to sneers or silence found themselves listening to the faint murmur of German voices rising from the barracks, prayers of gratitude spoken softly into the dark. Romano overheard one and muttered to Walker, "Imagine that, praying for us instead of against us." Walker, leaning on his rifle like a farm fence post, grinned and said, "Guess pork roast wins wars better than bullets." The remark earned a laugh, one quickly smothered, but its echo lingered. Margaret lay awake, the taste of bread still clinging to her tongue. Hunger had been sated, but something else stirred uneasily within her. Why kindness? Why now? She had been told Americans were wolves draped in uniforms, conquerors who would degrade and destroy. Yet she had seen the young one, Walker, shift awkwardly as if embarrassed to serve her, as though kindness were easier to give than cruelty. She thought of her dead son, who might once have stood in a German uniform before a Russian peasant. Would he have chosen bread or the whip? The question gnawed at her, heavier than hunger. Clara's sleep came fitful. She dreamed of her hospital ward in Hanover, the wounded boys gasping, and of propaganda posters shouting that Americans would butcher every German woman they captured. Waking, she found her hand curled around the crust she had hidden under her blanket, hardening in the cool night. She stared at it, ashamed, furious at her own weakness. Yet even in anger, she took another bite. The bread tasted of humiliation and relief in equal measure. By morning, the camp routine resumed. Roll call, counts, records, the monotony of military order. Yet beneath the surface, something had shifted. The women stood straighter, their eyes less clouded with dread. The soldiers, too, carried themselves differently, less as wardens, more as awkward hosts. A strange, delicate bridge had been built overnight, fragile as dough before baking. Romano tested it the next evening. He carried a small bag of flour, traded from a nearby French villager, and dropped it onto the barracks table. "You," he said, nodding at Margaret. "You were a baker, weren't you? Show us how it's done." His words startled her, but her fingers itched for the familiar work. For years, she had dreamed of ovens while her stomach hollowed out. Now, with the Americans watching, she kneaded dough on the rough wooden surface, the rhythm waking something long dormant in her bones. The women gathered around, murmuring, and even the guards leaned closer, curious. As the dough rose, so too did Anise. Clara pulled Margaret aside, whispering fiercely, "Don't give them our bread. It makes us theirs." Margaret's gaze hardened. "Better theirs than no one's. Bread belongs to whoever eats it." For the first time, Clara faltered, unsure whether pride was worth starvation. When the loaves emerged from the camp ovens, the smell filled every corner. Soldiers and prisoners alike breathed it in, silent, reverent. Bread had become something larger than food. It was proof that survival could coexist with dignity. Even Captain Spencer, reluctant to admit it, broke off a piece and chewed slowly, as though swallowing the weight of command with it. The women ate, but they also remembered. Each bite seemed to scrape away the lies etched into them by years of slogans and speeches. The whip they had feared still hung in their imagination, but its shadow had grown thinner. What replaced it was no less terrifying, the possibility that their enemies were human. That revelation was harder to accept than cruelty. Night fell once more, but the camp did not return to silence. From one barack drifted the faintest sound of humming, a lullaby, old and German, rising from Elsbeth's lips. A few soldiers stopped to listen. The melody lingered in the air like smoke, fragile yet impossible to ignore. Romano turned to Walker and muttered, "The walls are thinner than we thought." What neither of them knew was how quickly those walls, once cracked by bread and pork, would collapse under the weight of truths yet to come. The news did not travel in words but in smells, in gestures, in the quiet miracle of a meal. For the German women, the pork and bread had been more than food. It was a disruption, a collapse of certainties built by years of propaganda. They had been told, shouted at by posters, hammered by speeches, that Americans were cruel, brutish, barbaric. They would whip women, starve the old, laugh as they humiliated the defeated. Yet here, within the barbed coils of captivity, they had tasted something else entirely. And it was that taste, more than the rifles or the fences, that shook the foundation of their beliefs. Clara Weiss clung hardest to her old convictions, for surrendering them meant surrendering herself. She sat on her bunk, arms crossed, muttering to the others that one good meal did not erase the blood their captors had spilled. "Meat can hide poison," she hissed, though her lips still gleamed with fat from the pork she had devoured in secret. Pride warred with her stomach, but every whiff of bread baked in the camp's oven scraped at her defenses. She had once thought of Americans as wolves. Now she saw them as farmers, absurdly young farmers with clumsy German words and awkward grins, serving food as if war were a distant rumor. Margaret Hoffman felt the change differently. Bread was not just bread to her. It was identity, memory, faith. When Romano placed flour in her hands, she had felt her body remember every gesture, kneading, folding, coaxing life from yeast. The bread she baked for both captors and captives was more than sustenance. It was testimony. With each loaf, she betrayed the Reich's story and replaced it with her own. That survival sometimes required taking the enemy's hand. She wondered whether this small act of kneading had branded her a traitor or a prophet. Elsbeth Kruger laughed at the tension, her voice a dry rattle that reminded them she had seen too many regimes to be awed by their myths. "Propaganda is just bread with sawdust," she declared one evening, gnawing on a crust as if to prove it. "Looks like food fills the mouth, but in the end it rots the gut." Her cynicism, once dismissed as senile rambling, now struck chords in the others. Even Clara fell silent, staring at the loaf in her hand, as if it were a weapon turned back upon her own beliefs. The Americans, for their part, struggled with the inversion. Corporal Walker, still chewing gum, marveled at how easily the women reminded him of home. One afternoon, he confessed to Romano, "My grandma makes bread just like Margaret." "Smells the same, too," Romano grunted, stirring a pot of beans, and replied, "Maybe we're all prisoners of our grandmother's kitchens." They laughed, but beneath the jest lay unease. Was this kindness undermining their resolve? A soldier who begins to see his enemy as family might hesitate when the rifle must speak. Captain Spencer noticed the softening of boundaries with growing alarm. He wrote in his journal, by lantern light, that discipline weakens when the enemy's face looks too much like your mother's. Yet even he could not deny the effect of the meals. Violence drained from the air. Guards watched more than threatened. Prisoners answered more than resisted. Something subversive was happening, not in the form of escaped tunnels or riots, but in the slow dismantling of propaganda's grip. The camp was becoming a place where enemies dined at the same table, and Spencer feared that such intimacy was more dangerous than bullets. Nurse Ellen Carter felt the shift in her rounds. When she handed out medicine, women once rigid with suspicion now met her eyes. She recalled Clara gripping her wrist one evening, whispering in broken English, "Why you give us bread? Why not hurt?" Carter, startled, replied softly, "Because you're human." The answer sounded naive even to her ears, yet Clara's stare lingered, haunted not by cruelty but by kindness too large to fit the shape of her beliefs. The irony was almost comic. Nazi leaflets had painted Americans as beasts, yet the real beasts had been hunger, cold, and despair, gnawing at their bones long before capture. The women realized, slowly, that their true enemy had not been the soldier with the rifle but the machine of war that had starved them, used them, lied to them. Bread was the proof. Here, in captivity, they ate better than in the villages they had left behind. That truth was unbearable and yet undeniable. Margaret, kneading dough one dusk, murmured to herself, "This bread will outlast the Reich." Romano, overhearing, raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. He understood. Food was memory, and memory could undo 1,000 speeches. Still, shadows lingered. Clara could not let go of the thought that every kindness carried a hidden hook. She whispered warnings to the others. "They feed us, so we will forget our sons, our husbands. They want us tame." Yet even as she spoke, she licked her fingers, savoring the last trace of butter. Her words lost force when her hunger betrayed her body's gratitude. The climax came one night when Walker, curious, asked Margaret to teach him the trick of scoring loaves before baking. He clumsily dragged the knife across dough. Too deep, too crooked. The women laughed, a sound sharp and startling in the barack. For a moment, war fell away, and there was only the absurdity of a farm boy fumbling at a German grandmother's elbow. Clara's lips twitched despite herself, and Elsbeth smacked the table, wheezing with mirth. Even Spencer, watching from the doorway, felt the corner of his mouth betray him. Laughter, too, was treason against propaganda. Yet the laughter carried an undertone, a danger none could name. If bread and pork could dismantle years of lies, what else could it do? What would remain of hatred if mercy persisted? The women began to fear something more terrible than the whip, the possibility of forgiving their captors. That forgiveness would not feel like triumph, but like betrayal of the dead. Clara lay awake that night, staring at the rafters. She thought of her son buried in the east, of posters screaming that Americans were demons. Yet in her mind, she saw Walker grinning sheepishly with flour on his hands. Her heart tightened with rage, confusion, and an emotion she could not name. She pressed her palms to her eyes, whispering, "This cannot be real." But the smell of bread still lingered in her hair, refusing to be forgotten. The next morning, the camp awoke to a sky streaked red with dawn. The ovens smoked again, and both guards and prisoners gathered, waiting. Margaret pulled the loaves free, steam rising like incense. She handed the first piece not to a fellow German, but to Romano, who took it silently, chewing as though he swallowed not bread, but history itself. The women watched, silent, as the act repeated, food passing from hand to hand, enemy to enemy, until there was no clear line between giver and receiver. Propaganda had promised whips, chains, starvation. Instead, there was bread shared at dawn. The women felt the ground shift beneath them, as though the very logic of war had cracked. Yet they also felt unease coil tighter. If the enemy was not what they were told, then what was left of everything they had believed? And it was then, with crumbs still clinging to their lips, that the sound of boots thundered toward the camp gate. News from the front that would test whether bread could hold stronger than the whip. The storm rolled in without warning. A bruised sky torn by sudden lashes of lightning. Rain slanting across the camp in sheets that turned dust into mud and pathways into rivulets. The barracks groaned under the weight of water, roofs dripping, the fragile calm of bread and pork threatened by nature's indifference. Soldiers ran with canvas and rope, shouting to one another above the roar, while prisoners huddled in corners, clutching blankets that could not keep the wet away. Yet as thunder rattled the walls, something unexpected happened. The divide between captors and captives dissolved, not through orders or treaties, but through necessity. Margaret Hoffman was the first to move. When she saw the sacks of flour stacked near the leaking storehouse, water spilling toward them like an eager enemy, she rose and cried out in German, her voice sharp enough to pierce the chaos. Romano understood the gesture before the words, cursing under his breath as he rushed forward. Together, baker and soldier, they dragged the sacks higher, lifting them onto tables. Others followed. Walker grabbed crates. Carter steadied the women as they carried what they could, and even Clara, whose pride had resisted every kindness, threw herself into the task, her gray hair plastered to her face as she hauled with a strength born of desperation. For once, no one paused to question sides. The storm became a test of bodies, but also of hearts. Romano barked orders in English and German alike, his voice uniting where silence had once divided. Spencer himself waded through the mud, shoulders hunched, his boots sinking, his authority no shield against the rain. He shouted at guards and prisoners equally, and for the first time, no one questioned the oddness of that equality. Ellen Carter tore strips from sheets to tie sacks closed, her hands raw and red. Walker slipped, sprawling in the muck, and it was Elsbeth, frail as parchment, who helped him up, muttering, "Even young legs stumble." He grinned at her through the rain, mud streaking his face, and in that absurd smile, something fragile yet unbreakable seemed to spark. Hours passed like minutes. The storm beat them mercilessly, and yet within its fury a covenant formed, unspoken but felt. Hands that had once trembled in fear now found strength beside those they had called enemies. Bread dough was kneaded again that night, not by Margaret alone, but by Walker clumsily pressing beside her, Romano guiding, Clara watching with narrowed eyes that finally softened. The loaves baked unevenly in the flickering ovens, their crusts cracked, but when they were pulled out, steaming, the smell rose above the rain like incense from a cathedral. The women and soldiers ate together, standing in mud, drenched and shivering. No one laughed, no one jeered. They chewed in silence, every bite tasting like survival itself. Yet food could not silence grief. It was grief that finally broke the last wall. That night, as the rain slowed to a steady whisper, Clara sat apart from the others, staring into the mud. Walker, restless, approached and crouched at her side. In halting German, he asked why she looked away while the others ate. She lifted her chin, her eyes hard as glass. "My son," she said simply, the word carrying the weight of a tomb. "He died in the East. Your country, your allies, took him from me." Walker swallowed, the gum gone from his jaw, replaced by something heavier. "My brother," he whispered, voice cracking. "Tunisia. He didn't come back." The silence that followed was louder than thunder. For a moment, their griefs stared at each other like duelists. Then something shifted, anger folding into recognition, pain mirrored and multiplied. Clara's hand, weathered and trembling, reached out without command from her pride. Walker's larger hand met it, not gently but firmly, as though anchoring them both to the truth that loss had made them kin. Carter, watching from the barracks doorway, felt her throat tighten. Romano turned away, pretending not to notice, but his eyes betrayed him. Even Spencer saw it, and in his journal that night, he wrote, "The war makes enemies, but sorrow makes family." The climax came not with violence, but with revelation. At dawn, as clouds broke and pale light fell over the sodden camp, Margaret carried a loaf of bread to the fence. She broke it in half, one piece for the prisoners, the other for the guards. She held it up like an offering, her voice low but steady. "This is what is left of us," she said in German, and Romano translated, his throat tight. "This is what we are. Not whips, not propaganda. Only bread." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Spencer stepped forward, took the half mint for the soldiers, and raised it before his men. "So be it," he said. The loaf passed from hand to hand, across lines that once seemed impenetrable. Soldiers bit, women bit, the crust cracking between teeth of enemies who no longer knew how to hate. The bread became more than sustenance. It was covenant, thunderous in its quiet defiance of the war itself. Yet even as crumbs fell into the mud, the horizon carried new thunder, not of storms but of artillery, distant but creeping closer. The front was moving, and with it would come decisions the bread could not prevent. As the sound echoed faintly across the camp, every heart clenched with the same thought. This fragile truce, born of pork and bread, would soon be tested by the return of war's iron hand. The whip was not gone, it only waited, and none knew whether bread alone could hold it back when the gates trembled again,